set the recording on so that those who missed tonight can catch up. And Emma's going to look at the media as allies in the fight against domestic violence against children and women and children, how the media can foster more prevention of domestic, family and sexual violence. And there are 3 approaches she's going to be looking at: the primary, secondary and tertiary approaches. And after this meeting tonight, I'll be circulating a diagram that sort of summarises those things. So if you've never heard of that sort of terminology previously or have questions about it, obviously tonight raise them with Emma, but also have a look at this diagram when we circulate it after the meeting. Okie dokie. So Amy, you're the only journalist here at the moment. You're the only journalism educator here at the moment, even though we're expecting a couple more. What has your university been, how have you been preparing students for covering domestic, family and sexual violence?
Look, at the moment, I actually don't teach into any journalism units, just the way that the cookie crumbles right now. Yep. So some of my focus has been then translating this back to the academics who do. We have lots of, and starting to even embed that and look at some units where we can specifically look at it in more depth, because at the moment we're making it almost a standalone assessment rather than a module of specific study. And really beginning to see that a module of study in that is increasingly important. So when we're reshifting some content, that's one of our focuses in the next sort of couple of months, is to embed that and maybe in a small way into one of our introductory level units, and then in a larger way into more of our senior level units. And when we get to that senior level, opening up opportunities for students to take some self-led projects in that direction as well.
Terrific. That's a really good start. Do you have all the resources you need? Can, for instance, Belinda Cox at Micah Projects or Helen at NAPCAN help you with resources that explain to students some of the finer points, or for that matter, Emma at Women's Health Queensland?
That would be lovely. Look, we're probably not yet at the stage where we're actually writing the content, but if it would be right, I would really appreciate being able to reach out and share with you what you're thinking, what we're thinking, and then reach out for resources or gaps or any other information would be fabulous.
Yep. Emma, are you happy to speak to Amy?
Absolutely. You make me so excited to hear that it's being embedded into journalism courses. That actually gives me a lot of hope and makes me feel quite joyous for the future, Amy. So more than happy to help in any way, shape or form.
Belinda,
thank you so much.
Belinda, you've got a database that you run of people who have gone through the process of domestic violence and are willing to speak to the media. Would those people be willing to speak to journalism students?
Yes, some of them I would say would definitely probably be willing to speak to them. Look, I don't know if it's quite a database yet. It's probably not enough people to call it a database, but it sounds great. But yeah, look, some of them definitely would, and we're really fortunate that we've been able to branch out now and be quite a bit more intersectional than we used to, and have you know, some First Nations women, some disability representatives. We still haven't quite not as well rounded as we'd like to be, but we've got quite a number of women, you know, about 15 different women with varied experience, and some of them would be really happy to do that.
Yeah, and you've taken them through a media awareness type exercise, haven't you? So they're not completely raw to the experience.
Yeah, we're a part of the Voices for Change program, which well, I was really fortunate that I went to Melbourne and did the training on how to deliver Voices for Change training, as well as receiving support from some really amazing journalists like Kay McGrath and Gillian Whiting, who have helped us support, train most of our advocates. We call them the BDVS Resound Voices of Experience. Obviously, it's quite arduous to do that training.
Yes.
So I don't think all of them have completed it. I think most of them have, except some of our newer ones. But, you know, they're pretty savvy. And also I'm there as their, you know, support and, you know, debriefing, book agent, manager, all the different
and they've got some powerful stories to tell too, haven't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Some of our advocates have been featured in Courier Mail, ABC, on some quite big stories. It's been quite a lot of varied responses. So they've got.
Do you have affiliates in other parts of the state other than Brisbane?
No, we don't. Even just in regard to the Voices for Change program, which is national, we have like a national meeting now, but most of the other states in the capital cities, they have Voices for Change program. But for us, we were actually, the only state in Queensland, apart from Melbourne, who started the Voices for Change, because that's where our watch is, who had something like that happening. So it's still really developmental, and I'm hoping we're all hoping at some point that some of the other regional DV services will be able to do something like that, but ours isn't funded. I just do it on top of my workload and sometimes out of hours and whatnot. So it's not actually a funded program or a funded project. So it's pretty hard to kind of put that on other regional services who, as you can imagine, we're also we're just overwhelmed and we're in the crisis end of things. So, but we're ready if people want help or advice or support. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Is it okay for Amy to use the email address that was circulated when I did the MASA email tonight for you, Belinda?
Absolutely. And Amy, if you do email me, I will reply so that you have my mobile phone number. It's in my signature block, because I have horrendous and horrible emails. And if you ever email me and I don't reply, just call me.
Okay, Helen, for you, NAPCAN is all about prevention of child abuse and neglect.
Yeah, so that's actually what I was going to talk about a little bit, was that the portrayal of children in the media. So
fantastic.
I can kind of, I was just going to sort of whip through the very basic document that we did a few years ago, but I can just pass that straight.
That'll come up in a moment.
Yeah, so that's kind of there, ready to go if anyone.
Terrific. And you're going to take over, aren't you? Just before you do, I wanted to just ask those of you working in the domestic and family and sexual violence sector, what gaps do you see around media coverage?
Just broadly.
Mm-hmm.
Oh God. I think look, some of the gaps are really reporting on that more nuanced understanding of the complexities of domestic violence beyond just the physical. Mm-hmm. We are starting to see some change around that. Mm-hmm. I often do get the sense, and I understand the hesitation, because men's rights activists, well, that's what they call themselves, are vicious. I do understand the hesitation to really name gender-based violence for what it is. I get that, but that's something we'd really like to see come to the forefront. Media, you have your own demands. I'm just looking and I'm like, there's a bottle of gin in the background. Where I'm sitting, it's my little tiny mini bar. I promise I'm not drinking that bottle of gin during this meeting. I'm like, what else can you see? I don't. I'm
a journo. I don't care.
I think just really refining things. I actually think it's come a really long way. I think what's happened in the last 2 or 3 years is quite remarkable. But that they would be the biggest issues that we're seeing is around that nuanced understanding, that gendered analysis, and an interest in less focusing on the sensational individual elements of someone's story around, how many times did he hit you? What did he do to you physically?
So, yeah, that's a great idea. How about you, Emma? Do you have anything that you think is a gap in the media coverage?
The biggest things for me are probably around holding perpetrators to account and the media's role in prevention. And I think that's what I'll talk about later on. But I think the media is probably has the most powerful role of any sort of organisation or structure or system in terms of being able to really shape community attitudes and create the change. So I've been so impressed with the amount of pressure that has been on government over the last month, and just, you know, it's been the media who's just been really driving that and has not let up. And well done, media, because we can't, it doesn't matter how often we march in the streets, if we don't have the media supporting and holding people in power to account, we really won't get anywhere, because the media really does shape how the community sees men's perpetration of violence.
Yeah.
So it's really
and this past month, the 6 week, has taught us a great deal, but it's also had some fine women stand up and hold the blowtorch to those in that are accountable. So it's been really important from both a journalistic and a sector perspective to make what appears to be quite a significant leap in the cultural milieu. And that's, whether that's permanent or not, we'll just have to wait and see. So, okay, well, let's let Helen take control, and she's going to use the screen to show you her presentation and step you through about NAPCAN and its role.
Okay, share. Okay, yeah, I've got a lot to, is that all, is that working?
Yeah.
Yeah, for me? Okay. Yeah, so I'm from NAPCAN. We're the National Association for Prevention of Child Abuse and Neglect. So most of my work is very much about children and outcomes for children. I'm just going to quickly go through sort of two things. One is a set of guidelines that we did a couple of years ago that we called Guidelines for the Treatment of Children in the Media. And then talk a bit about some framing research. We've kind of become very interested in a lot of the framing research that's coming out. So there's some interesting things there that relate to all of our work. And just, yeah, as far as time, Trina, it's all in there, and there's links to everything. So feel free to just kind of cut me off if we're running out of time. But I will blast through it. Just a bit about NAPCAN. So according to our strategic plan, our aim is to help children, young people and their families by enabling everyone in society to play a part in keeping children safe and well. So we do a lot of professional development. In Queensland, we have free workshops about child abuse prevention, about creating child-safe organisations, protective behaviours, that kind of thing. We coordinate National Child Protection Week. In Queensland, we have Queensland Child Protection Week that a lot of you probably know about, and Kay McGrath's very involved with. They just sort of run in parallel, but I happen to be in Queensland, but I am more involved with the national work. And we're also involved with things like Children's Week and just general advocacy, consultation, research, and that kind of stuff. And really nice to hear it sort of, Emma talking about that. Like we spend all our life talking about prevention, the different levels of prevention, and let's put prevention in there. So it's really great to kind of hear other people banging on about that. In relation to domestic and family violence, we have the Love Bites program. So NAPCAN we're kind of the custodians of that program. We train the facilitators and they go out in the community and run that in schools. So you probably have heard about it. Just in terms of things in the recent times, it's been interesting to sort of be approached to actually talk about that respectful relationships education and the importance of prevention, because in the past, we would be talking about it a lot to schools, to anyone who would listen, and there's kind of been that feeling that, oh, it's okay, we got it under control, which clearly we didn't. So that's been promising. So I met these lovely ladies from Women's Health Queensland at the DV conference, and I was presenting on Love Bites. We got chatting a bit about media, and I said I had an interest in that, so that's how come I'm here. So I thought, so we put together these guidelines a couple of years ago, and it was at the time the Press Council was also doing a little bit of work about children in the media. I don't think it actually went anywhere, but I went to some interesting meetings with them, and we did a bit of consultation with young people. I'm kind of conscious that some of this is really, it's repeated in all these sorts of guidelines. A lot of the things are repeated in all those guidelines, and it's kind of probably a bit too basic for people who are, journalists, whatever. So I'll just really whiz through a couple of things. Because our interest is specifically about child abuse and neglect, I kind of brought that into part 3, but the first bits were really more generally about children in the media. So, overall, we're advocating for media to take a balanced and sympathetic view of children, to include the voices of children, consider children's interests, and specifically to report on child abuse and neglect in a manner that's helpful rather than harmful. And of course, domestic and family violence is a form of child abuse. So there's a lot of parallel in those sorts of.
Can I raise an issue from a journalist perspective? I know many people in management roles and who are educating journalists going out on jobs, they tell them not to interview children. And that's interesting because not without a parent there, but also not at all if you can avoid it.
And that's a big thing. And I do kind of I do think that's an important issue about the privacy and so forth. And also that even a parent's consent is not necessarily in the best interest of the child.
Well, the parent may also be traumatized.
Yes, and sometimes the journalist probably has a better idea than the parent about what the ramifications are of being involved in that story. So I will sort of touch on that, but so there's really the sort of 3 parts. Firstly, how are children represented generally in the media? There's a little bit of this work that's been done, talking about some of the linguistic bias, the topical and thematic bias. Youth tends to be a negative term. Crime tends to be over-reported. Sometimes children tend to be kind of like appendages to adults or just cute little things. So it's not necessarily about like saying what's right and wrong in those situations, but kind of interesting to be aware of how we do talk about children and whether we value them as citizens, I guess. When we talk to young people, they did say, oh, well, sometimes we want to have a say. So just on that, I thought there's a lot of organisations out there that do represent young people and do already talk to young people. And when you work in the sector, I don't know, I feel like there's always groups being set up and consultation groups. And so sometimes it could be really good for, I don't know if people do know about all of these organisations, but I thought sometimes for journalists to know that, Create Foundation exists and their job is to, represent the voices of children in out-of-home care. And, SNAKE is the voice of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children, things like that. So
very valuable, because it means that there's somewhere for them to turn that's an expert and not someone with just an opinion.
And then sometimes those organisations can kind of link you to the voices of children without having to actually interview a specific child or refer you to like the Mission Australia Youth Survey has some really interesting data, and the Children's Commissioners, that's their job, is to kind of get the voices of children out there. So whether it's it is problematic if you're talking about interviewing a child, but maybe there's other ways around that, and I don't know sort of how much of that happens, but it's something that we've kind of given a bit of thought to, and because I know there's a lot of those groups out there. The second bit was just about the rights of children in the media, and that's that stuff that journalists kind of already do so well and know so well, because they have to be really careful about that stuff. But when we were having these conversations, there were a few things that didn't always come up in hadn't always come up in conversation, and they were things like, even if the parent consents, is it still in the child's best interest? And that point that journalists might know better than the parent, because you can't, and I think I certainly haven't put my children in difficult positions, but I know that sometimes someone says, oh, do you want to do this thing? And you're like, yeah, sure, because you kind of, and is it really, is it really the best thing? And of course, in terms of child abuse and neglect, often it's the family members who are part of the problem. So you have to be particularly careful in those situations. So it's good that, like you say, journalists are very, very cautious about that stuff. I also, the UNICEF guidelines for reporting on children are really interesting. I don't know if people use them or know them, but they're very comprehensive, and I often tell people about them, and so they're interesting. And then part 3 was sort of more specifically about our work, which is about how do we talk about abuse and neglect. So we had based that, or sort of adapted it from Our Watch's reporting on child sexual abuse guidelines, and then added stuff about the other forms of abuse. And it's those same issues about actually naming what is the abuse. Like when a child gets beaten, it's not severe discipline, it's abuse. And likewise, when there's sexual contact, it's rape or abuse. It's not an affair or sex or relationship. The other big thing for our organisation, because we're very much about sort of context and I guess the sort of the role of the broader community and society and so forth. When we get into those sort of common stories of blame and demonization, we often lose the opportunity to kind of have a valuable conversation. And the one that comes up time and time again is, of course, like child safety departments. You end up sort of blaming the child safety officer and not really getting into what were the risk factors for that family. So I'm looking forward to hearing Emma, because I think that idea of how do we get prevention messages into the media is really important. So I'm sure it'll be really useful. So that document exists. It's just, once again, it's not a sort of funded project, so it kind of sits there, and I like to have it there to kind of keep the conversation alive about children in the media. But welcome feedback, and if there's other work in that area, I'll keep adding to it or doing whatever. Occasionally someone says they use it and I'm like, oh good. So I'll keep it there, and it'd be great if it kind of gets some light.
Access. I'll make sure that goes around. Just a quick question to Erin before we jump on to the next section. Erin, often what journalists report, particularly around child abuse and neglect, is what they hear from police. So do you also have that relationship with NAPCAN?
I believe we do kind of on an officer level. I know, I guess from where I'm coming from, it is more of a media perspective or a campaign perspective from the QPS rather than an operational perspective, although we do work closely with the DV unit. But I know I've heard a lot about the Love Bites program, and that I know that officers do run that in schools and that sort of thing. So yeah, I don't know how, I guess, formalized it is. I know we have a lot of different relationships with various different areas, but yeah, I'd be happy to kind of connect with you more on that when we have, appropriate. From my perspective, it's more of the proactive campaign side of things, and when we are like, planning content and that around it. Yeah, it'd be great to partner up on it.
Yeah, great. No, I'd be really interested in that. And if I sort of talking about some of the framing stuff is also really relevant to sort of government departments in the campaign area. Like, how do we actually present these stories and talk about these things? So yeah, that's really good. NAPCAN's we're very small. We're a very small organisation, but we're very flexible. And because we're a not-for-profit, it's very easy for me to kind of get an expert to talk to someone. I don't have kind of like complex levels of approval or anything like that. So that's
good.
That's a nice thing for journos. It's like, yeah, just call and I'll put you through to someone.
Okay.
Or I'll do it and just amend my title a little.
Okay. How we keep it to another, say, 3 or 4 minutes?
Yeah. So the other thing I wanted to just flag was we're really interested in this kind of framing research that's coming out, and you're all communicators, so you kind of know about the importance of how we frame things. But there's a couple of bits of research that I just thought might be particularly interesting. Obviously we're still sort of looking at the job of the media is not necessarily to sort of like garner support for programs, but it is kind of nice to know that our words are kind of contributing to the public discourse rather than turning people away or promoting a sort of negative way of thinking. So I'll just race through a couple of things. These are two bits of research that are Australian. One's about how we talk about parenting. It doesn't include things that are specifically about domestic violence, but it really, the main thing in that research is shifting from what they called an effective parenting frame to a child development frame. So effective parenting frame was like, this is how you be a better parent, this is what a good parent does, here's some tips, that kind of thing. And the child development frame was about putting the child at the center. So children, children thrive when they have safe, stable environments. So that it can be kind of applied to any area of family life. Mm-hmm. The how to tell the core story of early childhood is more about actual early childhood development. So it talks about sort of how we can talk about play and how children's brains develop. Once again, it is kind of relevant because the more that people understand, I was going to go into this a little more, but the more we understand how children's brains develop and the effects of early trauma, the better we can kind of, we can get people to actually understand that things like domestic violence are really important issues for children, and not to leave children out of those conversations. This was just some stuff. This is what kind of comes out of some of these framing. You end up with like things to avoid and things to do. That's just an example of the, this was an example of how they use the effective parenting frame and the child development frame. So was pretty sort of stark results in support for those particular programs. But importantly, when we're talking about issues and we haven't done the research about how to frame them, sometimes we're doing damage. So when we were using the effective parenting frame, we're actually kind of like decreasing support for some of the things we were trying to talk about. So that's why this sort of research is really pretty exciting. This is probably too long to go into, but this is like really with the framing, we're kind of moving from these unhelpful ways of thinking, and these are probably concepts that you guys contend with.
More than familiar with.
yeah. So the individualism, that everything's personal choice and that kind of thing. So all of this is kind of about shifting over to the right and looking, of course, like we were talking about context and that everyone needs support and these kinds of things. So big shifts, but also important that we're all kind of, once we all start talking that sort of same language, it makes that shift a little easier. Specifically with domestic violence, I was just going to mention that when we bring in things like talking about toxic stress and how those, how abuse can affect children's brains, it can be quite valuable and actually sort of helping people to understand how important the issues are for children. And once again, talking about some of the framing stuff has suggested the brain architecture metaphor is really useful for helping the public understand how brains develop and therefore understand that early experiences are really important for children. You may have seen these. There's two bits of research that have just come out from Vic Health. Michael Flood was involved and they're with an organisation called Common Cause. So this one just came out last week about gender equality. It has a whole heap of interesting recommendations about what kinds of words that we can be using in order to kind of influence the people we want to influence. So interesting things like, instead of saying pay gap, we say pay discrimination. So it's not just a gap that exists, it's actually discrimination. So I thought they were really interesting. That document also gives some really great before and after examples. So I really like that, and tells us what to focus on. So it's probably a bit much to go through here, but this is an important one because it comes out in all the kinds of framing things that we need to spend a bit more time talking about solutions and start with some of the solutions rather than the overwhelming problem. So that does it in a really nice way. And you can also see with these examples, it's often just about like very small changes to the way we structure a sentence or the words we use can make yeah, I mean, I do trust the research is pretty rigorous, so I kind of, hope that it's as effective as we hope. And here we have this sort of idea that is also comes through in a lot of the research, which is about instead of kind of telling people, we've done a lot of myth busting, and some of the research suggests that the myth busting is not so great because you're kind of reminding people of that myth, rather it might be better to tell them the news story.
Yep.
But there's a lot to get our heads around. And then this is you can see from the diagram, a related bit of research that was about framing masculinity. So I think, yeah, but they're just great because they're so, they're so simple in terms of the, the little examples. Yeah.
That's fantastic, Helen.
Yeah.
I just am aware, can you unshare the screen for a moment, because it allows me to just invite, I've lost one of the people that tried to log in. So I just want to pop her, it's Angela Romano from QT. Angela, so it's from A.
While Trina's doing that, I'm going to ask Helen, are you willing to share those slides with us?
Yeah, absolutely.
That's great. Thank you.
If you send them to me, Helen, I'll shoot them around after this meeting.
Yeah, I have because I have, in my role, I'm able to kind of like look at a lot of this stuff, and even my workmates are like, can you just pull out the good bits, because you kind of end up having to look at all these. There's some other ones that are related to juvenile justice and all sorts of things that overlap. But yeah, I'm happy to share, and I'll put the links in there.
That's fantastic, because it's becoming literate in this material that helps journalists not only understand, but also over time evolve their own language that they report. And Emma will tell you that when I first joined Women's Health Queensland, I was getting my knuckles rapped quite regularly for using terms that would be very familiar in newsrooms but were actually outdated in the sector. So anything like that is a helpful tool.
Interesting.
Okay, so thank you very much, Helen. Is any other questions from the floor for Helen? No? Okay, so what elements do the rest of you feel make strong or constructive news coverage of domestic, family and sexual violence? And that can include covering children as well. Can you give us some examples?
I think the language stuff that you spoke to, Helen, particularly Michael Flood's work in terms of holding perpetrators to account, calling it out as men's violence, just really shifting that language to put perpetrators and the issues to the front rather than it being as kind of this passive occurrence. So I think that's something that all of us in all our work need to just continually remind ourselves. And I think a lot of the work that Michael Flood's doing is really leading the way in that space.
We had discussed at the DV conference that we'd probably include Michael Flood in one of our meetings this year. So hopefully I can get him for the next one, Emma. That'll be great. Amy, what do you see are the challenges for journalists in taking this journey and changing?
I suppose, and when I'm thinking about students particularly, sometimes students come from a range of experiences and backgrounds, and you really have no idea. Sometimes you've had students with very intense personal awareness of this space, and then you have other people who quite thankfully have no idea at all.
Yes,
exactly, and we're grateful for those. We want that. But it's about bringing them together. And I was just actually thinking while you were talking, Helen, about that resource in the report talking about bias. And I was thinking I have an assessment coming up where we're looking at problematic media stories around all those moral panics, young people in video games, or young teenagers in sexting. And I just thought, oh my goodness, thank you for that resource, because if I include that, that takes it to another level. So not just it's problematic because it's untrue, but it's problematic because it feeds into this idea of not representing youth voices. So that was really, really helpful. So thank you for that.
It's excellent. Okay. Do we have alternative ways of illustrating domestic, family and sexual violence stories so that victims and survivors are not re-traumatized? And I go back and I have an apology from Kate Lemon. It's been a terrible day in the newsroom and she's still at work and still organising things for tomorrow's coverage, which will also be pretty hectic. But what Kate said at the very first meeting was that it's sometimes hard to tell domestic, family and sexual violence stories because on television, you need video, you need vision, you need content that will stand behind a presenter or will work on its own, or will be an interview that is with one of the experts in the field, but you just need vision. And I guess what I'm asking, are there alternative ways of illustrating some of these ideas that the sector wants to get across, so that they're not left with this question, well, there's no pictures, so why would we bother?
I would love to make a go, Belinda, go.
Go, Belinda.
The TV.
Right to live.
Look, I come from this from two different aspects. My brothers both work in film and television. One of them used to do the graphics, the computer graphic depictions of things for Channel 7. And so, you know, they'll use things like that for multiple other stories. It's certainly doable, you know, for domestic violence. And we were given a really great example of that when we had the launch of our first round of women going through training. We had a reporter from Channel 10 come and have a chat, and she interviewed some of our women, and was corrected by me a couple of times around her questioning, and completely changed what she was doing. And I gave her an info sheet, which she took back and clearly handed to someone who does do their graphics, did an absolutely beautiful, so she showed the interview, and then she also had them do up this beautiful moving infographic around statistics that she stood beside and pointed to, and it was so beautiful. It was so polished, and that was just for me giving her that piece of paper. So it's definitely something that's achievable, and they've already got things like that in place. They use so many of those graphics to depict other things. You know, it's all there for them to do. So yeah.
Well, Kate will be listening back to this later, so I'm sure that'll be helpful for her. Emma, you were going to say something?
Yes, I was, and I think using graphics is a great strategy, Belinda. I think that really highlights some of the issues, but also I think we need to get away from some of the kind of stereotypical images that get portrayed, you know, of women looking really like beaten down, again, bad phrasing, but that kind of like cowering woman, you know, in the corner. Yes. Because victim survivors are normally really strong and really resilient. And I actually think we need to start framing that conversation a little bit.
That's interesting, because those choices are made necessarily usually back in the office, not by necessarily the people who are out in the field. So it's contingent upon those who are out in the field to take that message back and talk to the editors or the graphic artist or whoever it is that's placing the image. But I noticed that just recently we had a DV story, and it had the classic woman sort of sitting there like this, and, you know, someone hiding in a corner that's going like that. And I'm thinking that, you know, it's not particularly constructive.
Yeah, and look, one of the things that we've done with our Voices for Change is we decided, because we were given a small amount of seed fund, it was very, very little, but we decided to invest in a professional photographer who did some amazing headshots and distance shots. And anyone familiar with Channel 7 will know it's the grounds across the road from the car park, but really some really beautiful images of the women just, you know, standing really strongly together, or just you know, looking serious. I'm not necessarily you know, like cheering or smiling, you know, looking serious, but looking very, very strong and empowered and standing tall. And we got some beautiful photography that we, you know, that we keep on file to offer, you know, for use for the media.
Yeah. So any of the organisations that can do that sort of thing, that adds to the corpus or the library of images that can be used for those stories, whether that be in print, online, or on television. And of course, if you've got some, I'll pull the plug here for radio, if you've got some audio grabs too, that's fantastic. So, okay, I'm going to move on now. Our next guest speaker, I'm actually ahead of time. Does anyone else want to ask or reply to that?
Yeah, look, Oops.
Hello, Angela. Welcome.
a number of years ago, they started in India doing alternative images because they were tired of the cowering woman. And I have seen a number of stories over the years, and I just did a quick Google search, and actually there've been a number over the years of different types of images. And actually, interestingly enough, some of those do have, actually they try to focus on the perpetrator. So creepy guys standing in the corner looking at a woman to show, well, that is actually kind of creepy, and various empowering images. Now they're culturally different. You wouldn't appropriate them as is, but it is interesting they've tried to do that. One thing that does stand out is that these are for stories, I think, more generally about sexual violence or attacks on women. They're not suitable necessarily for individual specific cases or incidents because, you know, you might have implications of guilt or otherwise in terms of pending court cases, etc. But it is probably interesting to look at different images around the world and recognise that, you know, in a culturally diverse society, maybe there are some images that we could borrow too here in Australia. We're not necessarily always the leaders. Sometimes we can be the followers and take advantage of that too when trying to communicate with culturally diverse communities.
I'll introduce you, Ange, to the rest of the group. We've got Helen Fogarty from NAPCAN, and we've got Emma Owinska from Women's Health Queensland, Belinda Cox from Domestic Violence Service in Brisbane. It's also Micah Project, who you'd know, and Amy Johnson from Central Queensland University. I almost said James Cook, but it's Central Queensland University. Oh, she's got a mild dog emergency. Oh my goodness. Yeah, so we're going to move on to our next guest speaker, which is Emma Owinska, who is has been my boss, but is now my client at Women's Health Queensland. And she's going to take over the screen much the same as Helen did. There we go. All yours, Emma.
All right, so I'm hoping that you have got the one that says Women's Health Queensland.
Yep.
All right. Well, today I have the absolute privilege. I'm just going to move this one over here and get my screens together. Of talking about the media's role as an ally in prevention. And I'm going to explore what primary, secondary, and tertiary approaches are and how they apply to the media. So firstly, I'd like to do an acknowledgement of country. I'm currently on Mengen land in Brisbane, and I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. And I'd also specifically like to acknowledge the important role that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women play in maintaining the health and wellbeing of their communities. I'd also like to acknowledge the many women advocates and organisations and survivor advocates who've spoken out about the issues that we're talking about today and the work that they've done for decades around this. The work that we do really builds upon that, and it's their dedication and their advocacy that really allows us to be here today. It's also very critical that we continue to learn from and include the voices of women when we're seeking to prevent violence from occurring against them. So what I'm going to cover today is making sure we all understand what drives gendered violence, that I share an understanding of what prevention frameworks are, and also looking at how the media can harness that understanding in those frameworks in the work that they do in terms of being allies in prevention. So the big question, what causes violence against women? And this was a really interesting one when we had the media forum that we ran a year ago now that looked at reporting of violence in the media. We actually surveyed the participants who partook in that, particularly from the media. And one of the things that came out of that was that there wasn't a strong understanding of what actually causes violence against women. Some of the responses that we got through were quite varied, but none of the responses we actually received from people who are working in the media were actually able to highlight that it was actually gender inequity that actually was the cause of violence against women. So I think it's really, really important that that we keep that at our forefront of our minds when we're talking about violence against women and men's perpetration of violence. So that's actually gender inequality and that power imbalance that drives the violence. So when we look at the work of Our Watch and a lot of other primary prevention organisations, they really highlight that there's 4 key predictors that are going to lead to high incidence of rates of violence. And the first one of those is condoning violence against women. The second one is men's control of decision making. And that's both at the structural level as well as the personal level. So we know the more that we have men making decisions in positions of power and in government, the more likely we are to have higher rates of violence than if you have women in those positions of power making decisions. Rigid gender roles and stereotypes and how we feed into those and play those out, and those subconscious biases, as well as when they are really strict, rigid roles that are really easily identifiable. And the last one is male peer relations that emphasise aggression and disrespect towards women. So we see this play out with men's football teams. We see this play out with all the stuff that we've had in the media recently in terms of private school boys and the violence that they've been perpetrating against young women. It's also really important to mention colonisation and its impacts, because one of the things when we talk to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women, that those rigid gender roles are often not highlighted as being the cause of domestic and family violence or violence against women or men's perpetration of violence. Often it's really seen as intergenerational trauma and the effects of colonisation and the impact that that has had that leads to such high rates of violence being perpetrated. So 3 out of every 5 Aboriginal, Torres Strait and Islander women will have experienced physical or sexual violence by a male that they know. And that does not necessarily mean that that's an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander male. That could be a white male that's perpetrating violence against them. So that's also a really important thing to highlight as well. So can we stop men's perpetration of violence against women? Well, the short answer is yes. Yes, we can. And we're making great inroads all the time. And the work that the media has been doing recently has been super helpful in that space. So the reason why the media is so important is that it's the media that provides the lens and shapes the way that the community and our society view men's perpetration of violence. I think I was speaking a little bit earlier just about how important that role is and how important it is that we really harness that in terms of looking at the pressure that's been on the government over the last month. It really is the media that's been really putting that pressure on continually, and we've seen the ABC in particular really hold that pressure there and really hold that government to account. So the media really has the power to shape the way things look moving forward in terms of violence perpetration. So in the sector, we talk about 3 approaches to preventing violence. So the first one is primary prevention. So primary prevention is really about what can we do to stop violence happening in the first place. So in the sector, we really look at this in terms of probably the most effective form of primary prevention, which is frequently highlighted internationally in all the research and by the UN, is respectful relationships education. So that is the one key thing that has the most evidence behind it, that if you work with young people and give them really great respectful relationships education, they are far less likely to go on and perpetrate violence later on. The second approach we talk about and part of the framework is secondary prevention. And that looks at how can you intervene. So how can you intervene with high-risk groups? In the sector, this is often bystander intervention. So you see something happening and then what can you do to intervene at that point? So I'll talk a little bit about what that looks like from a media perspective and what intervention looks like as that secondary prevention. And the third is tertiary prevention, and that's looking at what can you do once it's happened to try and stop it happening later on. Now, these can sometimes intersect, but it's really helpful to use this framework when we look at the media as allies and in the different ways and strategies that can be used. So I'm going to start with tertiary prevention. And the reason I'm going to start there is because that's what we're seeing play out in the media at the moment. We're looking at the power that the media has had in terms of being a tertiary prevention ally when we're looking at things like what's happening with Brittany Higgins, what's happening in calling out some of behaviour in the Liberal Party and in Parliament. So tertiary prevention focuses on two key things. One is holding perpetrators to account and also holding structural inequalities to account. So looking at the structures and how they drive and how they're driving the violence. The second one is supporting victim survivors to tell their stories. So how can you support victim survivors to tell their stories safely in their own way? So holding perpetrators to account. So this is when we're talking about language, and this is building on some of that work that Michael Flood does as well in terms of talking about violence. Sometimes we talk about family violence. It really does soften it. So family violence somehow sounds not as bad as men's violence or men's perpetration of violence. So all of us really need to think about how we change that language and how we continually think to really put the perpetrator to the front and make them the active user of the violence.
Can I just get in there for a second, Emma? I've had an interesting experience in the last couple of weeks where we've been talking about family violence on air, and the callers we've had have been even women, and mostly women have said, but they're not the only ones. I mean, they're as bad as the Men's Rights Associations, that they keep coming at us saying, you know, you're biased against men. And we're not, because we're reflecting what the sector tells us, that the vast majority of survivors and victims are women.
Yeah, and that's all the research. You know, you can talk to you blue in the face and say not all men or women do it too, but we all know that all the research everywhere says, you know, that it's going to be far more likely to be violence is going to be perpetrated against both men and women by men. So it's really important that we keep holding that it actually is, the issue is men's perpetration of violence, whether it's against other men or against women. Mm-hmm. Women are far more likely to be the recipients of violence than men. I think it's 1 in 4 to 1 in 16, but it's always most likely to be the men who are perpetrating violence. So
something you once pointed out to me was that quite a significant proportion of the women who are accused of being violent are being violent as a result of being a victim, and that they're lashing back to protect themselves or their children.
Absolutely, and it's how a lot of a long time ago, I used to work in women's prisons doing acupuncture, and I worked with I worked in maximum security women's prison in Victoria, and I used to go in there and treat inmates with acupuncture. And one of the things, all the women that were in there that I had contact with, who were in there for murder, were all in there for killing violent partners. And I really hope that we start to get a shift in the criminal justice system so that we're not punishing women who are basically in self-defense fought back against after years of abuse. Anyway, I'm going to get back on track. I'm going to go sideways. Otherwise, no. It's an interesting conversation. So one of the things that we do sometimes see in the media is this talk about there was he snapped, or there was stress, or the relationship break on, or she moved on and had a new partner, or she took the kids. That's one of the ones that I hate the most, that she took the kids, and so that's why he was violent. So we really need to step away from those narratives. A woman is normally keeping children safe from a violent, abusive partner. And we are seeing some shifts away from character referencing the perpetrator. We used to get a lot of that. He was a good bloke. And I've noticed in the last maybe 6 months, we're seeing a lot less of that, which is great. Jane Gilmore's work is excellent in this space. She pulls up the Courier Mail at least once a week, if not more, in terms of the work that she does. And this one I chose specifically because it's looking at court reporting. And she actually wrote a great sort of one-pager about court reporting and how to do court reporting well. So with this one, she's really, this court reporter had spoken of like intimate text, love heart emojis, and tried to make it into this kind of intertwined relationship, rather than really holding the perpetrator to account, that there was a man's trial for strangulation, assault, and willful damage. So one of the key things really in that tertiary prevention in terms of holding perpetrator to account is all about the language, putting the perpetrator in view, and remembering that that person is choosing to use violence, that it's a choice that the perpetrator is making. So when we're being tertiary prevention allies, one of the other things we need to be doing, which is key, supporting the victim. And I loved the fact that with Brittany Higgins coming forward, I really did not see narratives around, oh, she was drinking and all these types of things, which we often see play out. I know that, I think today there was an Adelaide radio presenter, Jeremy Cordeaux, who was just sacked for actually calling her a silly girl and
who drunk to
say some pretty vile things really about Brittany Higgins, and he was sacked. So it was great to see that leadership in the radio space, that they would not put up with that and allow that to occur. It's really important that we highlight the victim survivors' rights, and that's their right to justice in whatever way, shape or form they would like that to occur. Being trauma informed in your news reporting, so allowing the victims and survivor to tell their story in their own way, ensuring that you've got informed consent, that they know what's going to happen with that story, what possible consequences could be, and prioritising their safety and well-being. Now we're going to go into secondary prevention. And this is the one that we're talking about, which is often around how can you intervene? How do you intervene with those high-risk groups, which it could either be at high risk of experiencing or perpetrating violence? And what part can you play in terms of lowering that risk? So one of the key things that we know that it's men who are going to be the ones who are most likely to be perpetrating the violence. So it's really important that we start to make sure including men's referral service numbers, and even putting these at the top of the pile, at the top of the list of numbers. We're always thinking about how we support victims, which is significantly important. It's important we have there, but it's also how do we call out perpetrators, and how do we build that into stories, that if you are a man who's used violence or you're at risk of using violence, you need to get help, and to keep putting that in the conversation all the time.
Emma, are the results coming out of these types of services that help men reimagine their responses to violence, are they as effective as some of the other support services in terms of outcome?
I don't know, Trina, to be honest. There's really mixed men's perpetration programs. There's really mixed results. They say a third get good outcomes, a third there's not much change, and a third use it as a way to figure out more ways to perpetrate violence. So we're yet to have any really good research, I think, in that space in terms of what works.
Actually, I think that's also a question when Michael Flood comes that we can ask him. The other issue I think around that is the fact that men, why do men go to these services? Sometimes they may go in a genuine attempt to reform. In other cases, it may be that they're being forced to. It may be that, or a very serious other consequence, which might, affect the efficacy, I have to imagine. But also just the numbers of services. And I believe that Michael may be doing research to try and develop more, I don't know for sure, but I believe he may be doing research to look at development of more effective services. So that may be something really good to check with him, because he would be much more up to date on that end of it than probably just about anyone else around.
I think one of the things that's very important to bear in mind, one of the things that something I've been backfilling a team leader position, and I actually facilitate men's groups, which is extremely interesting. And I've just been the team leader for our men's program, and we have 4 men's programs. We've got 3 that are mandated, one that's voluntary through a very exclusive referral pathway. Is that it's not even so much about the expectation of change. It's really about making sure that these groups and these programs are operating correctly in a way that prioritizes the safety of women and children first over the men's change, and making sure that there are those women's advocates. So I think it's important to have the conversations about whether or not there is a capacity for these programs to change men's behavior. As you mentioned, we know that the data says that it doesn't change them a lot. So in any conversation that we're having about men's behaviour change programs, we need to have conversations about what format these programs are following to put safety mechanisms in place for women and children as a priority. I just really had to throw that in there.
No, that's great. I love your contribution, Belinda. Thank you.
So, and also just from the research end, because I am on the Human Research Ethics Committee at QUT, so I'm aware of some of the conversations that happen in different institutions around, studies of these types of projects, because sometimes you'll have someone who actually wants to trial a new type of intervention and then do research on it. So I do know it's also, quite, for all the best reasons, really difficult to try and actually innovate, because, there are so many people saying, be really careful, that it can actually take a long time to go ahead, which in some ways is good. It makes sure you're not doing things willy-nilly that could cause harm. But I guess at this point in time, there's a lot of nervousness about trying something new and innovating, just because of what would happen if you don't quite get it right. Mm-hmm. So, we want the best, and we would like more services and more diversity of types of services, I guess, for different types of men. But it's a really difficult one. So back to you. Sorry.
No, that's all good. So the other part of secondary prevention is calling it out. So this is, in the sector when we look at bystander, but it's about how that applies when you're in the media, and how you can hold people you're interviewing to account, highlight statements that are made that contribute to gender inequity, calling out those bad behaviours and holding people accountable. Investigative journalism really sits in this space of secondary prevention. So we saw the great Louise Milligan piece last year of Inside the Canberra Bubble, and kind of everything that's fallen out from that. I'm going to talk a little bit about intersectionality in a minute and how that looks at high risk groups. But I think on Q&A it was called out the other night that one thing about this Inside the Canberra Bubble that it wasn't intersectional enough, because it was looking at experience predominantly of sort of white educated people living in this space. But it was a great, what's fallen out from this piece is really, I think, a great example of investigative journalism that looks at high-risk spaces, and what can you do in a high-risk space, and how can you call out what's happening as in a high-risk space to become an ally in that secondary prevention framework. So just to go into intersectionality, so intersectionality looks at when we have not just gender at play, but when we start to have things like sexual orientation, race, gender identity, people who are living with a disability, and how all these things come into play to make someone at much higher risk. So we know that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women are at much higher risk. People with disability are twice as likely to experience violence as people who don't have a disability. It's the same for CoP women, for trans women, etc., etc. So when you're thinking about this in the media and how you sort of work in the space, it's really important that we think about how we can draw attention to those structural and systemic barriers. So we know that CoP women are going to have visa restrictions. It means they won't reach out for help, which can make them more vulnerable in a whole range of ways. There can be discrimination in service provision. And I was actually talking to the CEO of a multicultural organisation the other day, and they have offices all over Queensland. And she was talking about how in some of their employment offices, 80% or more of the clients that they support are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, and they all choose to go to this multicultural organisation as an employment service. And she'd asked why, and they said, because we know you won't be racist. That was the response. We know because you're a multicultural organisation, you're not going to be racist. So it's this discrimination in service provision that's sort of built into our communities and to different services that can have huge impacts as well. And so it's really important that we highlight community solutions and approaches. And we've been really lucky to have Antonia Burt from We Are Lee come and talk to us at the last meeting, who really speaks to this really well about the importance of actually going and connecting with communities and hearing their solutions and hearing what that looks like and communicating that. It's really important that you don't highlight race, ethnicity, or other status unless it's really related to the story. Tarang Chwala, whose sister Nikki was killed, was murdered by her partner, speaks about this a lot, and he talks to the fact that so much of the media coverage of her murder focused on the colour of her skin and on her culture and on it as being an honour killing rather than a perpetrator choosing to take the life of a woman. So it's really important about how we put those narratives together. Same if we're covering Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women and their experiences of violence. It's important that we do link it to the systemic problems, so we don't, convey it as just a problem of that community. And this is something that horrifies me, but it's true. The more forms of discrimination or oppression a woman experiences, the more likely as a society we are going to condone the violence that occurs against her. So I think it's all of our responsibility to keep calling that out. So primary prevention. So primary prevention is when we look to solve the problem and change the trajectory, and we stop the violence before it even happens. So it's really around consciously avoiding those gender stereotypes. Childcare is often portrayed as this, it's a women's problem. Women's problem is childcare. So it's really important we start flipping that language. Childcare is actually a problem for parents. It's not a problem for women. It's a problem for women in that we often get to have to end up with the burden of the work falling on us, but it's actually a parent's issue. So it's really important that we keep flipping that language around. Describing women as strong and men as kind, and just making that normal that anyone can use different adjectives. It's really important that we consider putting an intersectional lens over all our work and thinking about the images that we choose, making sure when we're using experts that they're not all white middle-aged men, and we're really getting diversity there. I'm just going to share something really quickly, which looks at advertising and why we need to have how gender equality and how primary prevention can play out through advertising. That's a great, they came out of Women's Health Vic, and that's their campaign in terms of advocating for more quality in advertising. Thanks. This is my final kind of slide for us to think about, and that's about at the organisational level. So when we talk about primary prevention, we talk about changing structures. And so we look at how you can change organisational structure. So one of the quickest and easiest ways to sort of do it, to get the organisation on board, is to do an equity and diversity audit. This is the type of thing that Women's Health Queensland can help you with if you need the help, or provide you with resources. So we look at things like policy, staffing, HR policies, salaries, advertising, advertisers that you use and the way that you advertise. You can look at the news, the editorials that are happening, and you can set quotas and targets and monitor your progress. So that is how you really make a shift at that organisational level.
I might just ask Angela what she thinks about that.
Yeah, because I've always got opinions on everything, hey?
No, just I know that you
wonderful. I have actually been, I guess, encouraging what I would call, you know, initially we used to call it mainstreaming, maybe 20 years ago. I don't know what we would call it now, but just making sure that you have all voices in all sectors. So I think that's really wonderful. What I would say is, although I actually agree with everything, there's a lot of complexities around the reporting elements, or even storytelling elements, if you want to expand that further to include all sorts of different storytelling, such as advertising, what we see on social media. And I think with the Higgins, Miss Higgins case recently, if I talk about what happened on my Facebook feed, you know, you've got your friends and then you've got the kind of loose outliers who have sort of become Facebook friends through various means, and you know the communications around it, and then when you get to see responses to other people's comments on their feeds, kind of thing, it was just quite an eye-opener. And I think actually one thing that I don't think was covered particularly well was consent. I mean, there was a lot of discussion about the fact that young women were saying they were learning through this coverage that actually they had, you know, they realised that there had been non-consensual activities, rape or various other forms of sexual abuse of them through this discussion that had been raised. But I mean, I found, even as an older person, that British Police Cup of Tea video that was released a couple of years ago was really informative to me, because there were quite a few different scenarios that I'd never specifically thought about. And I sort of thought, oh, look, the way they articulated them, because often they're discussed as if they're grey areas, but when you put it in that clear language, it actually wasn't grey at all. It was actually very explicitly clear. So, I mean, I think one thing in the Ms. Higgins case was how could she actually have consented in the state that she was in? Consent was actually impossible to give for someone in her state, and yet that didn't actually get drawn out much. There was a continuous sort of important point to be made that she had never sort of brought a case to police, but that was sort of in some senses irrelevant to how Parliament handled it, because regardless of what happens in a police case, there's also what happens in your own organisation, which is a separate independent level of investigation and action, and not necessarily, you know, you're not taking someone to court. So I felt that was really interesting in terms of what you presented in those slides. And I mean, there was the gaslighting or whatever we want to call it that happened, the completely irrelevant, oh, she should have been sacked for cavorting half naked, drunken in Parliament House. When she was dragged in there, it would seem unknowingly and not in any particular state to say yes or no. And then once this happened, and you know, I can remember a particularly long feed that I actually fed into, and this was a social media conversation, all sorts of other fictions popping up, which I presume were fictions about what she had done or what, you know, these things. It's really, really complicated. And part of me wants to actually keep breaking down to something quite simple, such as that consent video with the cup of tea, to kind of actually keep repeating to people what actually are the issues here. Do you actually even begin to have the basic understanding to be able to look at a particular scenario and understand what it is?
And Angela, I thought as another working journalist, as you have been in the past, and you know plenty of editors around the place and news directors, how do you think they would respond to doing a diversity and equity and diversity audit?
Well, look, again, that's something that I used to suggest in classes when I taught relevant classes over the part, which I don't currently, but just that journalists should actually audit themselves. That you should look at the stories you've done in the last 6 months and say, well, look, what has been the diversity? And when I've covered, finance stories or, industrial relations or, defense, what's the gender balance been in specific kinds of areas? I don't know that you can sort of force organisations to do it. I've been involved in the Global Media Monitoring Project, which you might be aware is done by the World Association of Christian Churches, and they do this audit every 5 years of representation in the mass media around the world. And this year there were about 141 countries represented. The reports, the global report has come out, but the Australian figures we don't have yet because I've sort of coordinated that. So we get a sampling of media, and it was a specific day last year. They pick one sample day each 5 years. And so over the decades, each 5 years from 2010, I think was 2005 might have been the first one. I've been involved since 1995. And then sort of since every 5 years, and Australia has been represented most years, but you're sort of seeing, the classic figures for the last couple of years. I don't know about this last one because I don't have the data crunched yet. That it's been about 24% of sources are female, about, I think it's something like 40% of journalists are female. If you go to an area like sport, it's something like 2% of sources have been female. We expect that to increase. So look, an audit would be wonderful, but organisations just don't do it. So I think, sometimes you want to have multiple levels, encourage individuals to do it. Have a look at what they've been doing. How can they get more women? Then you have those organisations that actually put forward names of experts to help encourage and help journalists and help, encourage news organisations to audit themselves. And then we constantly have this research that keeps, providing snapshots that show where the industry is at overall. So I think that's actually helpful. I think, there's also some resistance. So I could sort of see in, the storytelling such as, during a domestic violence case, when someone's sending these sort of, love heart emojis and whatever, in some ways you actually want to report that in a sense that, people appear so banal. Their friends can all say he was a great bloke and he did all these cutesy things to actually show that, there can be all these signs of this person who's otherwise the great bloke, but it's like the banality of evil. At home, he went home and he was this absolute devil to the person who loved him most and treated him best in the world. So there can be some kind of levels of complexities, I think, also about journalists trying to incorporate some of those messages, because some of those stories are appealing to them for certain reasons, and they don't know how to use the bits that they want to convey necessarily with the impact that they intend.
And it's sometimes too, it's a filtering process as a reporter. What's going to lead this story? What's going to keep readers reading? And that drives them into how they frame their stories.
And I do know, look, I've sort of seen domestic violence among some of the women in my family, and I know people can respond very differently to different types of messages, and it's very hard to kind of understand what will be meaningful. So I know certainly a quite senior person now, she's a grandmother, she went through quite a terrible time in her life, but I remember her, she would do things like she would flick stations on the TV, and it was actually because it was a story. When she used to see stories about the guy who committed domestic violence and got off with a light penalty, she would get very nervous about this because she thought her husband could see those stories as an advertisement about what he could get away with. So she didn't want to see that. Whereas the point of the story was actually to try and gain social justice for that person and a toughening of those things, whereas she saw it because the risk of her personal situation is the opposite. If my husband hears this story, I'm fair game. And similarly, she might hear sometimes little fragments of the story about the guy, who's, I didn't see the headline fully, but I mean, the one who might have had, sent emojis and all cute things is, now, she'll actually say to me, warn your daughter, these guys, they look really nice, but they're like the big bad wolf who's smiling and saying, take me to your grandma's house and he's going to eat you up. So different people take quite different messages out of these. So maybe sometimes also when talking with media organisations, to recognise that sometimes what they think is best practice, what they're trying to achieve and what audiences actually get out of a message can be different. So to talk to them about how to still have compelling narratives to maybe convey some of the points they want to do it, but to start to shift them in ways that might better achieve those goals that they're after.
Thank you. Emma.
Great. No, that's great. It's a great feedback, Angela. I think you're right. I think it is around how you do good storytelling. Belinda and I had the absolute pleasure of being at Parliament House on Friday night to listen to Jess Hill speak, who, now frames herself as an advocate, and she uses that language. And she was incredibly, she was talking about criminalisation of coercive control. And I've heard a lot of people talk on that issue, and I've had a lot of people internationally talk on that issue. But to hear Jess's capacity to craft a story that really interwove women's lives and interwove DV and interwove, criminalisation and why it's needed. And she really brought those things together in a really accessible way. I was incredibly impressed with Jess Hill as a storyteller and an advocate, and it was really interesting, to see someone who's come, from, really being a media journalist to now sort of reframe how she sees herself as a communicator to really being an advocate, and her capacity to tell engaging stories that really brought all those aspects of prevention together in a really accessible, tangible way was amazing. I don't know, Belinda, if you have anything to add from your views on Jess Hill's.
Because I was just reflecting on what Angela was saying on, how can we find ways to support journalists to reframe so that they can see which stories are more appealing. But it's actually the journalists and the trailblazers like Jess who need to do that. For us, we're waiting for that opportunity. And I know for me, if someone, if a journalist contacts me about a story, they're not contacting me because they think I've got something new. They contact me because they know I've already got the stories there. But there's trailblazers and there's innovators, and there's really staunch journalists, often women, who are really saying, well, no, we're going to do things differently. And so what I do is I see my role is to remind them of that. And when I'm having those conversations with them, to say, this is great. Yes, the time is now for you to be doing this. You couldn't have chosen a better time to do this story. This is exciting. You're going to be a part of this. Our women really want to speak to you. We've got so much to tell you about this. We've only scratched the surface. You've got this opportunity to delve deeper and be a part of this big movement. And that's where I see our role, rather than, trying to reframe stories, but just really to provide that encouragement, because I think there's so many incredible journalists out there just waiting to do things like Jess has done, and look at what she's really what she's put out there, and what she's really given the opportunity for so many other journalists to see is that it is possible that we can have those discussions, and that kind of journalism and that kind of advocacy within journalism is valid, and that people will pay attention to it.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, Emma, did you want to wrap up?
I'm done.
You're done.
I'm done.
That's fabulous. Well, I'd just like to thank both our speakers tonight, who've been absolutely phenomenal. Have we lost Helen? Or am I just got the wrong?
No, she's there.
Oh, yeah, they're still there. Terrific. We've really had two very strong presentations that are not only thought-provoking but rich in resources. And so what I'd like to do, I've been recording most of this session to my computer, and I will upload it to Women's Health Queensland's YouTube site, and I'll send around the link so that if anyone's missed it, they'll be able to watch it back. But I'm thinking that there are segments in this we might like to break out and use in the COP down the track as well. And certainly with some training, which is now at the final stages. It's been with Emma for a bit, and then we'll be sending it out to confidential reviewers, and we hope to be starting training in May. So if you have students or journalists who you know that could benefit from trauma-informed interviewing skills, we're running a one-day training session. We're open to running it as 2 half days. And if you are located elsewhere in the state and it's too hard to get to a face-to-face session, we're also open to discussing an online version of the course, run probably over 6 sessions, which would involve online and Zoom for those that are in remote locations. So we don't want anyone to miss out. We do want to bring some of these things and some of the other trauma and journalism learnings right across the spectrum to people who don't currently have those skills. So being able to refer back to some of this and perhaps even use it in training would be incredibly valuable, I think. What do you think, Emma? You've seen some of this tonight. I think some of this is very valuable. Okay, themes for next time. What's Michael Flood's area of focus for his research?
Man's perpetration.
Mm-hmm.
He focuses on the man in the picture.
I think he has a really key focus on engaging men in the primary prevention of domestic violence. That's been something he's done quite a lot of work in the past. I don't know if he's branching out a little bit more, but it is getting men involved in that primary prevention because they're not as interested in it as women are. So yeah, some of those strategies.
Okay, that's brilliant. I think he'd be a great guest if we can get him along next time. I'm disappointed that we didn't have more journalists because we had 12 RSVPs, and of them 1, 2, 3 journalists who really were going to be here tonight are not, and I suspect that's because of the nature of the news today, and that's always the case. But I've really enjoyed this particular community of practice. I don't know about you, but do you think we do it at night again and give them another opportunity to do a night one, or do you think we should flip back to daytime?
The morning numbers were much higher. That's my only thing. We did seem to get a lot bigger numbers in the daytime.
Yeah. And that they specifically asked us to run it at night and then didn't turn up, but it has been a hell of a day. It's been a hell of a day in the newsroom.
Yeah. Maybe put a call out, Trina, and
see, you get a vote. I mean, I might put a vote up on SurveyMonkey. Yep. Has anyone else got any suggestions or themes they'd like us to look at in future? Or any journalists they'd like to invite to join the group?
Well, possibly if you do talk to Dr. Flood, because his focus is on, I guess, male heterosexuality, violence prevention and understanding, I guess, how to try and change male behaviour. Maybe you might want to talk to people who might do messages more that target men as audiences and readers to try and I guess, change attitudes there. Not to suggest that it's only men whose attitudes need to be changed. I mean, one thing that has really struck me with, again, being, so acutely aware of the coverage of Ms. Higgins' a particular case and the community response to it. I mean, you get a lot of very negative responses from women who equally say, what were you doing cavorting there? She should have been sacked, blah, 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 blah. I mean, women are just as much subject to all the stereotypes as men are. I mean, they absorb all that same socialization too. So we can't expect that someone who is not personally affected is always going to be any more sympathetic than a man who's not personally affected. But maybe he might be able to suggest people who might do some interesting stuff around communicating with men or changing men's perspectives in a broader sense. Because, when you do see these stories, I don't know if they still do it, if they still open up online stories to allow community comments, but certainly a number of years ago when they used to have anything about domestic violence and they had community comments, you'd have all these comments come through from men saying, well, all this money being spent on women, men are victims too, we lose our children. And some of and then the long streams of conversation go in and you have men shouting at women online and so on. So I don't know if they still have them anymore, but we do know that there's a lot of, even just not the perpetrators, it's the broader community attitude. So
there is a Brisbane group called Men Against Gender Injustice Collective, MAGIC.
Men Against
Gender Injustice Collective.
Yeah.
So it's MAGIC. I mean, it's very cute. And Ben Pennings, who's actually goes way back with Michael from years ago. Ben Pennings has had a lot to do with MAGIC.
Mm-hmm.
And they've held public forums, discussion forums. So I don't know if you,
Ben would be good. I know Ben. I've got a contact number for him too.
He's great.
Speaking about Ben's, that's reminded me. Ben Bjarnson from the Queensland Police Service, Erin, you'd know Ben.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah, he and I spoke briefly a couple of months ago now, but I think he'd be good to bring into this conversation too, because it's not just the heterosexual violence that we're looking at. We also have a problem with violence in the LGBTIQ plus community as well. So Ben Bjarnson might be a good person to have.
Also, if we want to hear some, just mixing things up, talking about getting input from traditionally from white men, there's also Quack are still doing some work around the domestic violence stuff, although I know that they can be quite difficult to get in touch with, but I think that's potentially worthwhile. Ash Broom.
Yep. Thank you for that. That's brilliant. Next meeting will be Monday, May 31st at 7:30 p.m. at this stage, but that may change when I do the survey. And there's one more after that, will be in July. That'll be our 6th meeting. And what I promised Emma we would do at that point is survey the participants and see what value came of the COP and what you would suggest we do in future. So that's sort of on the horizon, probably after the July meeting, so in early August.
Can we make the May one something special because it's DV Prevention Month?
I
don't know what I'm going to do to help that. I guess if I've suggested it, I have to do something helpful around that. But anyway.
Well, it will be, because we're going to be looking at hopefully Michael Flood and either Ben Pennings or Ben Bjarnson. So that will be looking at violence, domestic and family and sexual violence. So for DV Prevention Month. Emma, have you got any plans that you can talk about for Women's Health Queensland for DV Prevention Month?
We have a DFB forum coming up with BDVS as well on that group as well. So it's going to be at BMAC at the Story Bridge on the 7th. I'll have to check the date of May. I'll have to check what the date is. I think it's the 7th of May, which is going to be a full day event, which is Pathways to Safety. So it's looking at how all the services that are in the Brisbane region for people who don't work in the DV sector, and where the services are, who they are, what they do, how you refer, how you engage. So there's a whole day event around that, which is going to have lots and lots of speakers. There'll be a World Cafe style for discussion. It's going to be a really great day, actually. And I think I might be hosting it, maybe. And then
Are you going to stream it live? Are you going to stream it live?
There may be live streaming. It's possible that there may be live. And then we also have, I'm the president of Ending Violence Against Women Queensland, which brings together the women's health sector, the sexual violence sector, the DV sector, and the refuge sector. And so we all come together from across the state, and we have a primary prevention conference happening on Thursday, May the 13th. It's going to be 3 hours. It's going to be online. So everyone across the state can attend, and we're doing it in partnership with Our Watch. And it's going to basically cover what is primary prevention, why do we need to be focusing on it in Queensland, what does it look like in action, and then we're going to have breakout groups that will look at either specific topics or areas, and people will be able to choose and nominate to go into specific groups, and then we'll take the learnings from that and be able to move forward, hopefully, with some really strong primary prevention initiatives in Queensland by building those networks between all the sectors.
Yep.
So that's really exciting.
That's excellent. Thank you. Really, if you've got any feedback or thoughts after today's meeting, if you close off and then say, oh, I should have said that, just send me an email. You can either email me at the address I emailed you on tonight, or at trina.m@womenshealth.org.au. Thank you very much, ladies. Very useful. If you can recommend any men to join us, Sarah sends his apologies. He had a SES training tonight, so he couldn't be with us. He'll be with us next time.
Okay, Trina, I was just going to ask her, how do you actively recruit members, or do you ask people or put it out there, or how does it usually work?
Both ways.
Yeah.
So we invite people that we know may be interested. We get nominations from members of the COP, and no, Erin, did you have anyone that you wanted to suggest we include in this?
From our perspective?
Or even if the journos you know that you think might be interested?
Not at the moment, but I have a think, because I know we are in touch with a few people quite regularly, but yeah, we'll definitely have a think if there's anyone else we could flick the invite to.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your help on that matter. Helen, thank you so much for your presentation tonight.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for your very well articulated presentation, Emma. It was really good. Yeah.
Oh, great. Thanks, Helen. And thanks, Trina, for hosting, being a great facilitator. I'm actually still in the office, so I'm going home.
Oh, my Lord, girl. Go
I know.
home.
It's a long day. Ciao, ciao.
See you later.